Have you ever seen someone on a petty power trip take things way too far? You know the type, the self-important little tyrant who thinks a cheap uniform and a badge they probably bought online gives them the right to bully everyone. Stick around, because I'm about to tell you what happened when one of those homeowners association cops pointed a gun at my daughter. He thought she was just some young woman he could intimidate. He had no idea he was messing with someone who trains Navy SEALs for a living. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA gone wild. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and up until about 6 months before the incident, my life had been, well, quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. My wife, Eleanor, the vibrant, fiercely intelligent woman who had been my anchor for 43 years, had passed after a swift, brutal illness. The house, our house, suddenly felt cavernous, each silence echoing with her absence. Our daughter, Sarah, worried. She was stationed across the country for her work. Something demanding, she always said, with a dismissive wave of her hand when I pressed for details. Just government stuff, Dad, was all I usually got. To bridge the distance, and frankly, to escape the suffocating memories clinging to every room of our old home. I'd sold it, and moved into a smaller place in a meticulously manicured HOA community called Willow Creek Estates, much closer to where Sarah would occasionally find herself for temporary assignments. The brochure had promised tranquility, security, and a maintenance-free lifestyle. For a man nursing a fractured heart and seeking a gentle decline into his sunset years, it sounded like a balm. Willow Creek was indeed manicured. The lawns were an unnerving, uniform green. The houses, while varied in model, all adhered to a strict palette of beige and muted earth tones. And the rules, oh, the rules. There was a leather-bound tome detailing everything from the acceptable height of garden gnomes, not to exceed 12 inches, to the precise Pantone shade of one's mailbox. Eleanor would have had a field day with it, probably organizing a subversive movement to plant aggressively cheerful, non-regulation sunflowers. I, however, just wanted peace. I read the rules, sighed, and resolved to be invisible. The security of Willow Creek was personified by one Mr. Marcus Henderson. He wasn't a police officer. Not really, though his uniform was a symphony in polyester navy blue, complete with superfluous epaulets and a gleaming, oversized badge that proclaimed HOA security supervisor. He drove a golf cart outfitted with a flashing amber light and, most unnervingly, wore a sidearm with the kind of proprietary pride usually reserved for a family heirloom. Henderson was a man whose sense of importance had clearly outpaced his actual authority by several country miles. He was in his late 40s, I guessed, with a thinning comb-over, a perpetually smug expression, and a strut that suggested he believed himself to be patrolling the demilitarized zone rather than a suburban enclave of retirees and young families. My few interactions with him had been blessedly brief. A curt nod from him, a polite, avoidant one from me. He was the buzzing fly in an otherwise quiet room. Annoying, but ignorable. Or so I had thought. Sarah had come to visit for a long weekend. She'd been on some intense training cycle. She'd mentioned vaguely and needed to decompress. For Sarah, decompressing often involved early morning runs that would leave most athletes gasping, followed by meticulous attention to, well, anything that caught her disciplined eye. That particular Saturday morning, it was my slightly erratic sprinkler system. She was in my front yard around 7 a.m., dressed in simple gray sweats and a t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She was kneeling, examining a sprinkler head, her brow furrowed in concentration. The street was deserted, save for the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. That was when Henderson's golf cart whined around the corner. He spotted Sarah immediately, and I saw his posture stiffen from my kitchen window where I was making coffee. He gunned the little electric motor, pulling up to my curb with a self-important jerk. I couldn't hear the initial exchange, but his body language was aggressive, puffed-out chest, pointing finger. Sarah, I noted with a familiar mix of pride and anxiety, remained kneeling, looking up at him with what appeared to be calm inquiry. She always was unnervingly composed, I thought. The coffee forgotten, I started towards the front door, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. Henderson's voice, amplified by his indignation, began to carry. Don't recognize you. This is private property. Loitering isn't tolerated. Sarah must have said something, probably explaining she was my daughter, visiting. Her voice was too low for me to catch. But Henderson's next words chilled me to the bone. I need to see some identification, ma'am. Now, his tone was that of a drill sergeant addressing a particularly dim-witted recruit. I was halfway to the door when I saw it. The glint of dark metal. Henderson, his face contorted with what I could only describe as a sort of furious glee, had unholstered his firearm. He wasn't just holding it. He was pointing it two-handed directly at my daughter, my Sarah, who was still kneeling on the grass, looking at a damned sprinkler. A roar, an incoherent sound of pure, primal rage, ripped from my throat. I threw open the door and stumbled onto the porch, shouting, "Henderson, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Put that thing away. That's my daughter." Henderson startled, his head whipping towards me. For a horrifying second, the muzzle of the gun wavered, as if unsure which target to select. His eyes were wide, a little wild. She was acting suspiciously. Refused to identify herself, he barked, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah, incredibly, hadn't flinched. She rose slowly, gracefully, her hands held loosely at her sides, palms slightly forward, a gesture I didn't understand at the time, but which, in retrospect, screamed non-threatening professional. Her gaze, however, was fixed on Henderson, and it was like watching a hawk assess a particularly clumsy pigeon. There was no fear in her eyes. There was something else, an analytical coldness that was far more unsettling. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice utterly level, carrying clearly in the morning air, "you are pointing a deadly weapon at an unarmed civilian on her father's property. Your stance is unbalanced, your grip is incorrect, and your finger is dangerously close to the trigger guard, indicating a lack of proper training. I suggest you reholster your weapon immediately before you make a mistake that will have severe and lasting consequences for you and for this homeowners association." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her calm, technical takedown seemed to stun Henderson more than my panic shouting. He blinked, his mouth falling slightly agape. The gun wavered again, then, almost reluctantly, he lowered it a few inches. He didn't reholster, not yet. "She's my daughter, you fool," I yelled again, descending the porch steps, my legs shaking, but my anger giving me a strange sort of strength. She was fixing a sprinkler. What kind of lunatic pulls a gun on someone for fixing a sprinkler? Henderson looked from me to Sarah and back again, his bravado visibly deflating, replaced by a sullen confusion. Well, she should have said something. How was I to know? He finally, clumsily, fumbled the gun back into its holster, his face flushed a dull, mottled red. "Perhaps," Sarah said, her voice still icily calm, "you should have asked, rather than escalating to deadly force. That's generally considered best practice." She turned and walked towards me, not sparing Henderson another glance. As she passed him, I saw his eyes narrow, a flicker of resentment, of wounded pride in their depths. He knew, somehow, he'd been made to look like a fool, though he likely didn't understand the half of it. Sarah reached me, took my arm. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice was softer now, concern lacing it. "Am I okay?" I sputtered. "He pointed a gun at you, Sarah. A gun." My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The image of that black barrel, aimed at her chest, was seared into my brain. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, though her eyes were hard as she looked back at Henderson, who was now muttering something about security protocols and resident complaints before climbing back in his golf cart and driving off with a resentful squeal of tires. "But this," she added, her gaze sweeping over the peaceful, manicured street, "is not fine. This is not okay at all." Inside, the adrenaline crashed at me hard. I sank onto the sofa, trembling. Sarah, however, was a study in controlled energy. She made me tea, her movements precise and economical. As she handed me the cup, her hand steady as a rock, I looked at her, truly looked at her. The composure, The way she'd verbally disarmed Henderson even while he held a gun on her, it wasn't just strength of character. It was something more. "Sarah," I began, my voice still shaky. How did you stay so calm? That lunatic." She sat opposite me, cradling her own mug. "Dad," she said quietly, "there are things about my job I haven't fully explained. Government stuff is a bit of an understatement." And so, the story came out. My daughter, my quiet, bookish Sarah, who I'd last pictured teaching college-level history, or something equally sedate, was in fact Lieutenant Commander Sarah Penhaligon of the United States Navy. And her specialty? She was a senior instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Center. She trained Navy SEALs. She taught them close-quarters combat, threat assessment, marksmanship, de-escalation techniques under extreme duress. The men she trained were the tip of the spear, the ones sent into the most dangerous places on Earth. And she was one of the people who made them ready. The revelation left me speechless. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of my little girl learning to ride her bike with this formidable woman who could calmly analyze a gunman's stance while staring down the barrel of his weapon. No wonder Henderson looked like a fool to her, I thought, with a dizzying mix of terror and fierce, overwhelming pride. He was an amateur playing with a live grenade, and she dealt with professionals who disarm bombs for a living. "He was a danger, Dad," Sarah said, her voice losing its instructor-like edge and softening with concern for me. "Not just to me. His lack of training, his temperament. He's going to hurt someone if he's allowed to carry on like this. Pointing a weapon is the absolute last resort, after all other de-escalation has failed. He went from zero to lethal threat in under a minute over a perceived slight to his authority." A new kind of anger began to smolder within me, replacing the initial shock and fear. This wasn't just about Sarah being threatened anymore. This was about a dangerous man, enabled by a system, terrorizing a community under the guise of protecting it. This was about Willow Creek Estates and its ridiculous, overzealous HOA. Eleanor would have been incandescent with rage. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't just let this go. My grief had made me passive, but the threat to Sarah and the subsequent revelation of her incredible, dangerous life had reawakened something in me. A sense of duty, a need for justice. My skills weren't in combat, but I had been an investigative journalist for 30 years before I retired. I knew how to dig. I knew how to find the rot beneath the polished surface. "He won't carry on like this, Sarah," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I'll see to it." Sarah looked at me, a small, approving smile touching her lips. "I thought you might say that, Dad. What's the plan?" And just like that, the quiet, grieving widower looking for a peaceful decline was gone. In his place was Arthur Penhaligon, investigative reporter, albeit retired, and now father of a Navy SEAL trainer with a very specific, very personal assignment. Mr. Marcus Henderson and the Willow Creek HOA were about to discover that they had pointed a gun at the wrong family. My first step was to understand the enemy. Not just Henderson, but the entire structure that allowed a man like him to wield such authority and a firearm. I retrieved the leather-bound HOA Bible, as Eleanor had sarcastically dubbed it. I read every bylaw, every addendum, every tedious paragraph concerning security, governance, and dispute resolution. It was as turgid and self-important as Henderson himself, but within its dense prose, there were clues. Mentions of a security subcommittee, vague references to a contract with Willow Creek Protective Services, and the all-powerful HOA board, presided over by a Ms. Patricia Albright. Sarah, before she had to leave a couple of days later, gave me a crash course in what to look for from her perspective. "Check his certifications, Dad," she'd advised, sipping coffee as I took notes. "Is he licensed to carry that weapon as a private security guard in this state? What are the training requirements? Who vetted him? Does Willow Creek Protective Services even exist beyond him and AP? Box? Look for patterns in his behavior. Does he target specific types of people? When and where is he most aggressive?" His actions with me weren't just poor judgment. They were tactically inept. He created a higher-risk situation for himself and everyone around. That kind of incompetence usually has a history. Her insights were invaluable. She spoke of situational awareness, escalation of force continuums, and liability. It was a different language, but the core principles resonated with my old journalistic instincts. Follow the money, question the authority, find the paper trail. I started by making quiet inquiries among my neighbors. I was new, an unknown quantity, so I had to tread carefully. I began with Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who lived 2 doors down and whose prize-winning roses were her pride and joy. I'd seen Henderson's golf cart parked by her curb more than once, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Mr. Henderson?" Mrs. Gable had sighed, her wrinkled face clouding over when I broached the subject delicately over a cup of her excellent chamomile tea. "Oh, that man. He told me my garden gnomes were non-compliant. Bartholomew has been in my family for 50 years. She gestured to a rather cheerful, if slightly chipped, gnome peeking out from under a rose bush. He said if I didn't remove Bartholomew and his friends, I'd be fined. Fine for gnomes. Her indignation was palpable. It wasn't about pointing guns, but it was about the abuse of petty power, the bullying. Then there was Mr. Chun, a quiet engineer who lived across the street. He was initially hesitant to speak, but after I shared a carefully edited version of my concerns about security overreach, he opened up. "My son visited last month," he said, his voice low. "Parked his car on the street for 2 hours while we unloaded some furniture for him. Henderson ticketed him. Said it was against the rules for non-resident vehicles to park for more than 30 minutes without a guest pass displayed. A pass I didn't even know we needed for such a short time. He was rude, condescending. Made my son feel like a criminal. A pattern was emerging. Henderson the enforcer, and behind him, the faceless HOA board that empowered him. The next target of my investigation was Willow Creek Protective Services. A quick online search revealed it was, as Sarah had suspected, little more than a registered business name with a P.O. box address in a town 20 miles away. The registered agent? Marcus Henderson. There was no website, no list of other clients. It seemed Willow Creek Estates was his sole, and perhaps first, contract. I then decided to look into Henderson himself. Public records searches were an old friend. I found his previous addresses, some minor civil suits, mostly unpaid debts, and then, the interesting part, his employment history. He'd listed Chief of Security, Northwood Mall, on some old online profile. A few calls to contacts I still had in the local news business in that area painted a different picture. He wasn't Chief of Security. He was a security guard, one of many, and had been let go for, as one source put it, an overzealous attitude and several complaints regarding confrontational behavior with teenagers. There was no mention of any formal law enforcement training beyond a basic security guard certification that appeared to be several years out of date. The question of his firearm license was next. I discreetly inquired with a contact at the state licensing board. It turned out Henderson did have a license to carry a concealed weapon as a private citizen. However, the requirements for armed security guards were more stringent, involving specific training courses and regular requalification, especially if the guard was directly employed by an entity like an HOA or a proprietary security firm he himself owned. Whether Willow Creek Protective Services, and by extension, Henderson, met these more rigorous employer-specific standards was murky. The waters were getting very muddy indeed. During this period, I also made it a point to attend the monthly HOA board meetings. They were usually sparsely attended, dry affairs, held in the community clubhouse. Ms. Patricia Albright, the board president, ran them with an iron fist and a velvet glove. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes and an air of unshakable, faintly patronizing authority. Henderson was always present at these meetings, standing by the door, arms crossed, his holstered gun prominent, a silent reminder of who enforced the board's will. At my first meeting, I simply observed. I saw how Ms. Albright skillfully deflected any challenging questions, how she steamrollered dissent with pronouncements about maintaining property values and ensuring community standards. It was clear she and Henderson had a symbiotic relationship. He was her muscle, and she provided him the legitimacy and the platform for his power trips. It was at the second meeting I attended that I encountered a potential ally. An older gentleman, Mr. David Prescott, tried to raise a concern about a recent increase in HOA fees. Ms. Albright cut him off politely but firmly, stating the budget was non-negotiable and had been approved. After the meeting, I approached Mr. Prescott. He looked defeated. "She's impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "Used to be this board was responsive. Now, it's like a dictatorship. I'm Arthur Penhaligon." I introduced myself. "New here. I've had some concerns about Mr. Henderson's conduct." Prescott's eyes lit up with a spark of interest. "You too? He's a menace. I was on the board myself, years ago, before Albright took over. We never would have hired someone like him. The security firm we used then was professional, unarmed. This is different. He was my insider." Mr. Prescott, it turned out, had been a treasurer for the HOA and knew the bylaws and procedures inside out. He'd been ousted from a board when Albright and her faction consolidated power, largely, he suspected, because he questioned their spending priorities and what he termed their authoritarian creep. Albright brought Henderson in. Prescott explained over coffee a few days later. Pushed his company through without much due diligence. Said we needed a stronger deterrent after a couple of teenagers egged the clubhouse. Most of us thought it was overkill, but she could be very persuasive, and a lot of residents are too apathetic to question things as long as their lawns are mowed. Together, Prescott, Mrs. Gable, Mr. Chun, and I formed a small, clandestine committee of concerned citizens. We began to systematically document Henderson's transgressions. Mrs. Gable, bless her, turned out to be a surprisingly adept intelligence gatherer, chatting with other residents during her gardening, unearthing more stories of Henderson's bullying. Mr. Chun, with his engineering precision, helped create a timeline of incidents. Prescott guided us through the labyrinth of HOA regulations, identifying potential violations of due process and fiduciary responsibility by the board. My own journalistic skills came back to the fore. I compiled everything into a detailed dossier, sworn affidavits from residents, Henderson's questionable credentials, or lack thereof, the flimsy nature of Willow Creek Protective Services, photographs of his often aggressive posturing, some taken discreetly by Mr. Chun, and a legal opinion I'd quietly solicited from an old lawyer friend outlining the HOA's potential liability for negligent hiring and supervision, especially concerning an armed guard who had already brandished his weapon inappropriately. The incident with Sarah was the centerpiece, the undeniable proof of his dangerous incompetence. As our investigation deepened, Henderson seemed to sense a shift. He started appearing more frequently near my house, his golf cart cruising by slowly, his gaze lingering. He issued me a written warning for my newspaper being on my driveway for an excessive period. It had been there for perhaps 2 hours. Ms. Albright sent me a curt, passive-aggressive email reminding residents that all concerns should be addressed through official channels, and that undermining HOA staff will not be tolerated. It was a clear attempt at intimidation. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know about Sarah. They didn't know that every move they made was simply adding another page to my growing file. The stakes were rising. I knew we were approaching a point where we'd have to confront them directly. Sarah, when I updated her via secure video call, a precaution she insisted on, listened intently. "Dad, this is good work," she said. "Solid. But be careful. People like Henderson and Albright don't react well to being challenged. They'll see you as a threat to their little kingdom." She was right. Henderson, in particular, was a powder keg. His ego was intrinsically tied to his perceived authority. Our strategy began to crystallize. A quiet coup wouldn't work. Albright controlled the board too tightly. We needed a public forum, a place where the weight of our evidence could be brought to bear in front of the wider community. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled in 3 weeks. It was typically a rubber stamp affair, but it was also one of the few times a large number of residents gathered, and the bylaws stipulated that substantive motions could be raised from the floor if proper procedure was followed. Mr. Prescott knew those procedures intimately. The plan was this. Mr. Prescott would use his knowledge to ensure our concerns about security and Henderson's conduct were formally placed on the agenda, or, failing that, introduce a motion from the floor. I would present our dossier. We would have Mrs. Gable and Mr. Chun, and a few other residents we'd since cautiously recruited, ready to speak about their experiences. The linchpin, however, would be Sarah. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" I'd asked her. "Putting you in the spotlight like that, it's not your fight. Not really beyond what happened." "Dad," she'd replied, her voice firm. "He pointed a gun at me. He endangered you by his mere presence and incompetence. And he's terrorizing your neighbors. This isn't just your fight. It's about basic safety and accountability. If my presence and a clear explanation of just how badly he messed up from a professional standpoint can help put an end to this, then I'll be there." Besides, a rare, wry smile. It's not every day I get to professionally critique a mall cop wannabe in front of his employers. We decided she would only be revealed if absolutely necessary. Her very presence as Arthur Penhaligon's daughter would be a silent testament during the initial presentation of the gun incident. But if Henderson or Albright tried to dismiss it, to gaslight us, then Sarah would step forward, and her credentials would be our trump card. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, the tension in Willow Creek was palpable, at least to me. Henderson seemed to be everywhere, his golf cart a constant, buzzing presence. He took to parking across the street from my house for long stretches, just watching. It was unnerving, but I focused on finalizing our presentation, meticulously cross-referencing every claim, ensuring every piece of evidence was irrefutable. Ms. Albright, too, seemed to be shoring up her defenses. The pre-meeting agenda, when it was finally distributed, was packed with trivialities, clearly designed to leave little time for unscheduled discussions. She also sent out a newsletter reminding residents of the positive contributions of the security service and warning against divisive elements seeking to disrupt community harmony. The night before the annual meeting, I felt a knot of anxiety mixed with a grim determination. I thought of Eleanor, of her fire, her refusal to suffer fools. I thought of Sarah, of her courage and professionalism, facing down real dangers while I was preparing to face down a petty tyrant in a clubhouse. This is for them, I thought. For peace, for safety, for simple, decent accountability. The Willow Creek Clubhouse meeting hall was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Word had clearly gotten around, perhaps through Mrs. Gable's network or Mr. Prescott's discreet calls to old acquaintances, that this year's annual meeting might be more than just a recitation of budget figures. Ms. Albright sat at the head table, flanked by the other board members, mostly compliant, timid-looking individuals who rarely spoke. Henderson stood by the main entrance, arms crossed, his uniform freshly pressed, his expression a mixture of smugness and watchful suspicion. Sarah sat quietly beside me in the third row, looking like any other resident's daughter, dressed in unassuming civilian clothes. Only I knew the steel beneath that calm exterior. Ms. Albright opened the meeting with forced pleasantries, then launched into a lengthy, self-congratulatory summary of the board's achievements over the past year. She skillfully navigated through the pre-approved agenda items, her voice smooth and controlled. I could feel the restlessness in the room growing. People were waiting. Finally, as she attempted to move towards adjournment, Mr. Prescott stood up. "Madam President," he said, his voice clear and steady, "before we adjourn, there is a matter of grave concern to many residents that needs to be addressed. It concerns the conduct and qualifications of our HOA security supervisor, Mr. Henderson, and the safety of this community." A murmur went through the room. Ms. Albright's smile tightened. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her tone syrupy sweet but with an underlying edge of steel. "As you know, personnel matters are not typically discussed in an open forum. If you have a specific complaint, there are channels." With all due respect, Patricia, Prescott cut her off, using her first name, a clear sign he was dispensing with pleasantries. "This goes far beyond a personnel matter. This is about systemic failure, potential gross negligence, and an immediate threat to resident safety. We have a formal presentation and a motion to make." Henderson shifted his weight, his eyes narrowed on Prescott. I could see his hand drift casually towards his sidearm. Sarah, beside me, subtly leaned forward, her gaze flicking towards Henderson for a fraction of a second before returning to the front. She sees it too, I thought. Very well, David. Albright conceded, clearly displeased but aware that too overt an attempt to shut him down now would look suspicious. You have 5 minutes. That was my cue. I stood, a thick binder in my hands. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I began, my voice amplified slightly by the clubhouse microphone. 6 weeks ago, Mr. Marcus Henderson, your security supervisor, drew his firearm and pointed it at my daughter, Sarah, who was a guest in my home, on my property, engaged in the harmless act of inspecting a faulty sprinkler head. A collective gasp went through the room. Heads turned towards Henderson, whose face had gone rigid. He started to speak. Now hold on, that's not. You will have your chance to speak, Mr. Henderson, I said firmly, meeting his glare. For now, I have the floor. I then laid out the case calmly and methodically. I described the incident in detail, Sarah sitting silently beside me, a living testament. I presented the sworn affidavits from Mrs. Gable about gnome-related intimidation, from Mr. Chun about the unfair ticketing. I detailed Henderson's inflated resume, his expired certifications, the shell game of Willow Creek Protective Services. I spoke of his pattern of aggressive behavior, of the fear he instilled in residents. With each point, I placed a document from the binder onto the projector so everyone could see the evidence. Ms. Albright attempted to interject several times, with comments about misunderstandings and isolated incidents, but the sheer volume of evidence and the quiet, simmering anger now evident on the faces of many residents kept her largely at bay. Henderson, however, was not one for quiet simmering. When I presented the copy of his outdated basic security certification, he exploded. This is slander. I am a highly trained security professional. I know what I'm doing. That girl was acting suspiciously. She wouldn't identify herself. I acted according to procedure. He was red-faced, gesticulating wildly. This was the moment. My daughter, Mr. Henderson? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The one you deemed such a threat that you felt justified in pointing a loaded weapon at her chest. Sarah, would you please stand? Sarah stood. All eyes went to her. She was calm, poised, her gaze sweeping coolly over Henderson, then Ms. Albright, then the assembled residents. Mr. Henderson, I continued, what you and this board clearly failed to ascertain in your rush to hire an armed guard with questionable credentials is a rather pertinent detail about my daughter's profession. This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Penhaligon. She is a senior combat instructor for the United States Navy SEALs. She trains America's most elite special operations forces. She teaches them how to handle firearms safely, how to assess threats accurately, and how to de-escalate volatile situations under extreme pressure, skills you so demonstrably lack. You could have heard a pin drop. The collective intake of breath was audible. Henderson's jaw literally dropped. His face, moments before flushed with anger, turned a sickly, pasty white. Ms. Albright looked as if she'd been slapped. Even the usually impassive other board members stared, stunned. Sarah then spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority that filled the room. Mr. Henderson, she began, addressing him directly, her tone professional, precise, and utterly damning. Your actions on the morning of April 14th were not only unprofessional, they were tactically incompetent and grossly negligent. You escalated a zero-threat situation to one of potential lethal force within seconds. Your weapon handling was appalling. Your stance indicated a fundamental lack of training in managing recoil or maintaining situational awareness while armed. You failed to identify yourself properly as an HOA security official before making demands. You failed to use verbal commands effectively to de-escalate. You failed to assess the environment or the subject accurately. Had I been an actual threat, your approach would have likely resulted in your own injury or death, or that of a bystander. She paused, letting her words sink in. Pointing a firearm at an individual is an application of deadly force. It is the absolute final option in any escalation of force continuum, used only when there is an imminent threat of death or grievous bodily harm. Fixing a sprinkler does not meet that criterion. Your decision to draw your weapon was not only a violation of every accepted professional standard for security and law enforcement, it was an act of reckless endangerment. It exposed this homeowners association to enormous legal and financial liability. Frankly, sir, you are a menace, not a protector. You are precisely the kind of untrained, ego-driven individual who gives responsible, professional security personnel a bad name. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use hyperbole. She simply dissected him, layer by layer, with cold, irrefutable, expert precision. Henderson looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No bluster left, no defense possible against such an articulate, authoritative indictment. Ms. Albright tried one last desperate gambit. This is highly irregular. Lieutenant Commander Penhaligon, while your credentials are noted, this is still a matter for the board to handle internally. But the tide had turned. The residents were no longer passively listening. An angry buzz filled the room. Internally, shouted someone from the back. He pointed a gun at her. He could have killed her. He's a bully, cried Mrs. Gable, emboldened. He threatened me over my gnomes. Fire him, another voice yelled. And review this board. Mr. Prescott seized the moment. Madam President, I move for the immediate termination of the contract with Willow Creek Protective Services and the dismissal of Marcus Henderson, effective immediately, due to gross incompetence, negligence, and conduct unbecoming. I further move for an independent review of this board's hiring practices and oversight of security personnel. Seconded, came a chorus of voices. Ms. Albright looked trapped. Her face was pale, her usual composure shattered. She looked at Henderson, who was now staring at his feet, utterly defeated. She looked at the angry faces of the residents. She knew she'd lost. The vote was a landslide. Henderson was out. The review of the board was approved. In the chaotic aftermath, as residents surrounded me and Sarah, some offering apologies, others congratulations, Henderson was quietly, ignominiously, asked to leave the clubhouse by two of the larger, more imposing homeowners. He didn't even bother to collect his oversized badge from the table where he'd tossed it in disgust. His reign of polyester terror was over. The fallout was swift and satisfying. Willow Creek Protective Services ceased to exist almost overnight. Henderson, I later heard, faced an investigation by the State Licensing Board for Private Security, initiated by a formal complaint from our ad hoc committee, heavily bolstered by Sarah's official sounding, though privately submitted statement. His armed guard license was suspended, and given his record, it was unlikely he'd ever legally carry a gun in a professional capacity again. Ms. Albright, facing a vote of no confidence and the prospect of a humiliating public review of her tenure, resigned from the HOA board within the week. A new interim board was quickly formed, with Mr. Prescott reluctantly agreeing to serve as chairman. One of their first acts was to hire a reputable, professional security firm, one whose guards were unarmed, extensively trained in de-escalation, and focused on community relations rather than intimidation. The oppressive atmosphere Henderson had cultivated began to lift almost immediately. People started smiling more. Mrs. Gable's gnomes, Bartholomew included, reappeared in full, cheerful force, a small, ceramic symbol of liberation. For me, life in Willow Creek Estates transformed. I was no longer the invisible grieving widower. I had, somewhat inadvertently, become a catalyst for change. Several residents encouraged me to join the new board, and, after some thought, I agreed to serve on a newly formed oversight committee for community standards, determined to ensure that rules were applied fairly and with common sense, not as instruments of petty tyranny. It felt like a fitting way to honor Eleanor's memory. She had always believed in building community, not breaking it. Sarah visited more often. The cloud of concern that had always subtly shadowed her expression when she thought of me alone here, now visibly lessened. We'd sit on my porch, watching the now genuinely peaceful street, and she'd tell me carefully vetted stories about her government work, and I'd tell her about the latest HOA drama, which was now blessedly mundane, debates over petunias versus impatiens in the common flower beds. The gun incident, as it came to be known, became a sort of local legend, a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the surprising places strength can be found. It wasn't just about a bully getting his comeuppance. It was about a community finding its voice, about ordinary people standing up and saying enough. And for me, it was about rediscovering a purpose I thought I had lost with Eleanor. It turned out that even in the quietest of retirements, there were still battles worth fighting, still justice to be sought. So, what's the takeaway from all this? I guess it's that arrogance and a cheap badge don't make you powerful. Real strength lies in integrity, in courage, and sometimes in the specialized skills of a daughter you never fully appreciated until she calmly stared down a loaded gun and then proceeded to dismantle a bully with nothing but her words and her expertise. It taught me that underestimation is a fool's game, and that sometimes the most unassuming people hold the keys to a much-needed reckoning. Never judge a book by its cover, or a quiet woman in sweats by her demeanor. You just never know when you might be pointing a gun at someone who trains the best of the best. And that, my friends, is a mistake you don't want to make. Thanks for listening. I hope this story serves as a reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it seems daunting, is always worth it. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments.